It's Aaron, I'm on my grandmother's couch, we're talking tactics, let's get into it. Now the very first thing that we have to talk about before we get into the meat and gravy of this video is my usual disclaimer whenever I'm doing these kind of tactical videos, and that is that I do not condemn nor condone any of the things that I'm talking about in this video. It is simply just a video for educational purposes, and with that being said, let's get into it. Now, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary people alike, I am going to talk to you today about some anarchist tactics. But to first understand how anarchists work tactfully and tactically with each other, we have to first understand how they are organized. Now, anarchists don't usually believe in a hierarchical structure. We believe that all hierarchies should be questioned and that we should have the abolishment of all unnecessary and unjustified power structures. And with that, we usually function within a different framework. And that framework basically being from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. Now, how do we do this? Usually, it's done through a series of affinity groups and clusters. Now, affinity groups are small groups of individuals, usually between 3 and 10 people strong, that, when functioning within a cluster, usually have a specific role. Now, let's talk a little bit about protesting, because that's really where these affinity groups and clusters work the best, and what the point of this whole video actually is. So, the affinity groups within clusters that function in protests usually have a specific task. They are specialists in a specific field, and that can be anything from medic to frontline to communications to support to infantry to all sorts of other things, and they are usually very specifically tuned to do that job. That is done because it's easier to have a small group of individuals that are specialists that know that job best doing that job than it is to have whatever it is, a bunch of different people doing random things without any coordination whatsoever. Now, usually affinity groups and clusters are organized through a method of democracy, and this can be done in several different ways, but one that I've heard many times in the past, and what I'm basically basing a lot of today's video on, which was an article that I'm going to link in the description box below. It's from the Anarchist library, and I'll link it in the description box below. Now, like I was saying, clusters and affinity groups are organized through democracy, just like anarchists love to do. And that usually means that we have either a specific person or a group of individuals that work as coordinators, basically tactical coordinators within a protest. And when you are talking about your affinity groups, you have individuals that are elected by that affinity group to be that tactical coordinator, and they are usually called an ATAC, or an acute tactical coordinator. And within the larger structure, the cluster, you have something called a GTAC, or a general tactical coordinator. Now, the ATACs are going to basically be the team leader to a certain extent when it comes to the smaller affinity groups, and the GTACs are going to be the team leaders when it comes to the larger clusters. Obviously, we don't function in the same way that a regular military can or does, so there is going to be variation, and obviously the GTACs and ATACs throughout the day or throughout the week, whatever it is, can be replaced with other people or rotated around or set up as a group of individuals rather than one specific organizer. But it is useful in some situations to have one specific person to do a certain task for a certain amount of time, so they are, because they're doing it, they're probably going to pay more attention to certain things. It really depends on how you want to set it up, but that's basically how those sorts of things function, and obviously they can be voted out at any time whenever they do something that is against the will of the rest of the people. Now, ATACs and GTACs, you also want to have backups for these ATACs and GTACs, because it's a very strong chance that the police or the government or the state is going to single out the leaders or the people who look like they are leading any sort of group, and they're going to take them out first. That's a common tactic. So having backups and having them switch out with different people throughout the course of a period of time is a good idea, so you don't single out one specific individual, and if one specific individual is singled out, then you have backups ready. Now, Obviously, it works like that. Now, affinity groups, like I was saying a moment ago, they are specialists and they can take on specialist jobs. And they work basically as a cog in the machine, in the larger machine, when it comes to a cluster. But when you're talking about certain types of affinity groups, like black bloc affinity groups, usually they're going to be front line, they're going to be either offensive or defensive, and it's kind of required, or at least it's encouraged, that everybody that is doing those sorts of tactics have their first aid training, preferably advanced first aid, but at least bare minimum basic first aid, and a certain amount of combat training is talked about a lot in these different pamphlets, because they're usually going to be the ones, well, like their job is implied, on the front lines. So they're going to be the first the first barrier between the regular protesters, nonviolent or peaceful or whatever, and the state or the apparatus that they are fighting against. And that means that they are, in essence, creating a human shield. Now, when these groups are organized, it talks about in this pamphlet way back from 1991, so things have changed obviously now, but the way that they used to organize these sorts of things is they would usually organize these affinity groups into larger clusters, and these clusters would have a distinguishable flag that is basically a rallying point. And they would organize themselves in different ways depending on the demonstration that they were doing. But let's say a general large group of people in a square, say, they would organize it so that you would have individuals, say the front line, being at the front, back, and side to side of that group, basically being that wall. Then within that you would have different groups helping out as well. So I'll go through a list of different groups. Like I said before, you'd have medics, so a group of 3 to 10 people that function purely as medics to make sure that they're helping individuals that are knocked down or that are in trouble and pulling them out to safety and making sure that they can basically bring them back to health if they need to, patch them up if they need to, that sort of thing. Then down from that you have the front line, and these work as offensive and defensive forces. So like I said, they usually form the perimeter of whatever demonstration it is, and they're going to be the ones that are wearing the most gear, and they're going to have probably the strongest tactical unity within that group. They're usually called a black bloc, sometimes a gray bloc, but they're usually the protective element of the protest. And for more on their tactics and their gear, I have a video about that linked in the description box below, actually, and earlier in this playlist. Then obviously you have recon. So recon can be done in a bunch of different ways, especially nowadays in a more modern setting. You can do it with, say, drones or different forms of new kind of technology. But usually, at least back in the days that this pamphlet was written, they talk a lot about, you know, just cell phones or basically people on bikes riding around with walkie-talkies. They would be able to check out the surroundings and find out where the groups need to be. So if there is a presence that is required of a certain offensive or defensive group, say some people are being attacked in a certain area, the recon would come back. They would explain that to the GTACs or the ATACs, or they explain it to the GTACs would explain it to the ATACs. They would all send out over to that area, and they would form a defensive or offensive line. Now obviously next we would have communication groups. Now these affinity groups are going to be paying attention mostly to how communication is done. And like I said in the other video, I don't need to be giving away all of the secrets, so I'm not going to tell you exactly how the communication is done. But what I can say is that it's more important usually to have certain individuals dedicated to communication rather than everybody having walkie-talkies or cell phones all going at once, because we need to have tactical unity, and certain individuals that are dedicated to communications can know certain radio signals, they can know certain codes, they can know certain things that a regular person just would not know. So having a dedicated force to do that is better than having just everybody doing it themselves. And having tactical communication, but a small amount of it, is a lot more useful as long as everybody is working together. So that's basically the communication aspect of it. Then you're also going to have other things as well, like a group that does noise, for instance. Affinity groups that play, say, the bagpipes, or have some sort of music that they're playing while they're doing that sort of demonstration, can be really useful as kind of a psychological tactic. Now, psychological tactics are used a lot in all kinds of different groups and organizations and military forces. The police themselves use it. They use a Zulu tactic, I believe it's a Zulu tactic, where as they're marching in tune, they will actually beat their shields on every second step or something like that, so they can make sort of a psychological deterrent to people that are coming up. They also use loud horns and things like that to scare people away, sirens. So using psychological tactics like that can be very useful depending on the kind of organizing or the kind of activism that you're trying to do. And obviously you have inside of that your nonviolent or your just regular protesters who are going to be functioning as basically the body of the group of people that are doing the majority of this demonstration. And there are going to be usually a lot more protesters than there are Black Bloc or anybody like that that's on the outskirts. But the idea is to make sure that there is an overwhelming number of people there, even if some of them are peaceful or nonviolent or liberal or whatever it is. Then having that perimeter of the more tactical protesters in the past has been used to high degrees of success. Okay, so we talked about perimeter clusters, but now we're going to talk about the inner workings of the rest of this organization, right? So you have the perimeter clusters, which basically work as your front line. They are going to be the individuals with the shields or the strong gear or the pads or whatever it is that are using tactical maneuvers to make sure that the people on the inside are safe. Now, they are basically your defensive line. Now, just behind that, you are going to have your offensive line, or referred to more or less as your at-large cluster. Now, your at-large cluster can work as a defensive force as well. They are usually dressed up in protective equipment too, but they more or less function to work as a force that breaks down barricades and opposes an enemy. And they're going to basically work on tactics, organizing charges against that enemy from just within that line. So you're going to have your defensive force and then your offensive force, and they are going to work in tandem with one another depending on when they need to be at a certain place or where they need to be at any specific time. That's basically how that sort of thing works. Now, with your perimeter and your at-large, you also want to consider reserves, because reserves are a tactic that have been used by overwhelming degrees of success by military organizations all across the world and all across history. Now imagine this, you're in the very final hour of some sort of protest and it seems like you're finally breaking through and you're finally about to win, and the police have fallen back and they are unable to stop your overwhelming force, and then a bunch of buses show up and a bunch of brand new, freshly uniformed officers come piling out of those buses, ready to crack skulls. That's a terrifying situation to be in, and it's one that is not unusual. It's seen all of the time, and it's a tactic that can be used by anarchist groups and have been used by anarchist groups to overwhelming degrees of success in the past. Now, The same thing can be done, but it has to be done in a more tactical manner, because obviously if you have less than 1,000 people at a demonstration, taking a percentage of them out of that demonstration and holding them in reserve could destroy your movement. Usually the police organize about 1/3 of their force to show up as reserves. So that could be tactically smart, but only if you have more than 1,000 people attending. If you have 1,000 people attending, then taking about 300 of them out of that group and having them come in later on might actually be really useful. And if you have 2,000 people, then having 600 as a reserve would be extremely useful as well. That would work as a force that's able to come in at the very final hour and get that pep and energy back into those protesters so they're willing to get out there and fight until they win. That is basically how you use your reserve forces. And with all of these different organizations working together, they can work as a functioning, unified body that can actually win. And that's basically all I have to talk about today. It's just a basic rundown of how affinity groups and clusters work within a protest setting. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you do get a chance, check me out on Patreon. Every dollar does help fund this show. And get out there, get active. Politics isn't a spectator sport. Thanks for watching.